Welcome to Coffee with the Principals. I'm one of your hosts, Jake Booker, principal at Lake Grove Elementary, and this is my co-host and partner in learning, Brooke Perry.
I'm Brooke Perry, the assistant principal at Lake Grove Elementary.
So this is a podcast designed to explore one aspect of our school system that can be researched, written, recorded, and produced in the amount of time it takes us to finish our coffee. I am actually drinking a Keurig Guatemalan medium roast today. Brooke, what do you have?
I have my regular from a coffee stand that will not be named. It is an Americano with sugar-free cinnamon dolce and a splash of non-fat milk.
Well, that's way fancier than my coffee. So let's dive into it. This episode is part of our remote learning series. It's focused on how to create teacher clarity at a distance. We're continuing to dive into our distance learning playbook by Fisher, Frey, and Hattie. And if you're following along with us, we are in Module 5.
Okay, so in this module, there were a few big ideas, and the overarching idea was this understanding of clarity in our work. So a couple buckets in terms of clarity. There was clarity of organization. So really are the lessons that you're engaging with your scholars tied to some sort of standard. Clarity of explanation, and this is where the learning is made comprehensible, the learning is made relevant to your scholars. Clarity of examples and guided practice. So is learning illuminated in a way that allows for the gradual release of responsibility. And in there, we'll also kind of talk about success criteria. And then finally, clarity of assessment. So are we seeking and acting on the feedback that we're gaining from scholars as they engage in their learning?
Yeah. So when I read through these, it strikes me that, remote instruction and brick and mortar instruction are very similar, right? So like good instruction is good instruction. And the shift is really in the mode that we're using to interact with our students.
Absolutely.
And I think that Hattie points out here that clarity has a 0.75 effect size on student learning. So it's a pretty key thing we want to focus in on. So let's take a look. This literally, starting with the standards, is what I tell teachers to do all the time. All the time. So like I can remember back to way back when I first started teaching, and one of my principals told me to start with the GLEs. Those are the grade level explanations. He gave me this old torn up, set of paper books.
The GLEs.
Yeah, the GLEs, the grade level expectations, old school, right? And it was like someone gave me like this motorcycle to commute to work with, right? When I had been trying to get there on a skateboard. Then the state standards come out, and then we start to explore how to unpack, GLAD and unpack PSYOP strategies. And then suddenly you've got this big old yellow school bus, and I'm able to load all the kids on along with me as we're diving into like the standards and the actual thing that you're supposed to be learning.
Yep. I think the really important thing to think about, Jake, when we're talking about starting with the standards of just this practice, and you alluded to it, right? Just this practice of backwards planning. So this backwards design or reverse engineering, start with the end in mind. What do we need students to know and be able to do? And then work backwards. Now we're in a remote learning situation, and this backwards planning work is stuff we've been doing in person, but it's more important now than ever because the amount of time we have with our scholars because of the context of remote learning has decreased. So we really need to be super clear on what those nuggets of learning are, the standards, and how we're going to get at them with our lessons activities.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be really important to really focus in on and pay attention during those backwards planning sessions, making sure those all those processes, all the protocols are being kind of worked through as we work through those times.
Speaking of backwards planning, though, We are fortunate enough to work in a system where some of this work has already been kind of laid out for us, right? The groundwork has been done in terms of our curriculum adjustment guides. So we've been working from our GVC, our Guaranteed Viable Curriculum, and the associated guides for the last few years. But understanding that in this remote environment, our time is limited, teams of teachers have worked really hard over the summer to kind of condense what we need to be focusing on with our scholars into these curriculum adjustment guides. So one thing after really identifying those standards, the unit planning comes into play, and a term that the playbook really emphasizes is this idea of the flow of our lessons or the learning progression. So how are we going to move from one activity to the next in a way that ultimately gets scholars able to demonstrate proficiency on a specific standard?
Yeah, and one of the things that I really appreciated about these curriculum adjustment guides is that they're providing like a week at a glance.
Mm-hmm.
So it really gives you like a clear outline of what you can expect to be working on with your scholars during those 4 face-to-face live instruction days that you'll get. So it's a pretty well thought out structure.
It is, and it's something to build from. And I do want to say, like, as teachers, you know, and we know our scholars best, or we get to know them best by spending time with them, by assessing them, by doing formative checks of understanding, right? So we don't always have to be lockstep in what a guide says or what a curriculum says, but really just understanding that the flow of lessons is important. There's not a right way necessarily, but there are wrong ways, right? Especially when we think about mathematics and concepts that build upon each other. So just being aware of that.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about learning intentions, right? This is something that gets called out in the playbook. So something one of the things I noticed when looking over our new curriculum adjustment guides was that when compared with the GVC back in the old days, we had that GVC, and that gave us those learning targets for each lesson. The curriculum adjustment guides instead give us these big ideas. And we've got this big idea that kind of covers for the week. So what I would do is I'm starting to think about how you'll translate that big idea for the week into like these lesson-sized ideas, both your synchronous and that asynchronous lesson. I think it's going to be super important to be really thinking through that as we think about that adjustment to like the way we used to think about these learning targets that we used to get as part of the daily lesson.
Right. And it's going to be really important, like you just said, we have the synchronous and asynchronous time. So it's going to be really important to make sure these learning intentions or targets or big ideas or goals or however you want to word it are clearly understood by the students, because they're going to have half of a day every day and all day on Wednesdays where they're really in charge of their own asynchronous learning, and they need to have some sort of guidance of where they're going, right? They need to have a clear understanding of what their goal is, what their target is, what they're supposed to be learning, and why. So we just have to work to communicate that effectively to kids.
Yeah, and I think that's going to really feed well into this the next conversation. So it's about success criteria, and you know, success criteria is it's more than just a list of things they need to do. So success criteria, it's bigger, right? You're really unpacking what are those specific skills that you want students to be able to walk away with, and how are they going to be able to articulate that in their own way, so they can say what it is they're learning. And this is going to be really important when they're working asynchronously, right? Because they're not going to have us there to say, oh no, this is not what you should be focused on. So they have to have that very clear in their minds, and you have to provide that for them during our live instruction.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that making success criteria clear for kids, sometimes it means moving beyond the I can statements.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's showing them exemplars. Sometimes it's co creating a rubric of what a 1, 2, 3, and 4 look like in terms of writing an introduction paragraph. So sometimes you have to make it super concrete for them so they have a clear understanding of what does it look like for me to be successful in this skill.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about one of the final things from this module, and talk about relevance, right? So this is an idea that has literally been rattling around in my brain for decades. One of the very first things I learned working with kids was kind of this idea of flash versus substance, and it's that balance, right, that we need to walk if we're going to make sure that we're engaging scholars, but with really good, strong content, um, but not entertaining them, right? Like not going too far in one direction. So the trick is to really find that nice, even level balance. Early on, I went through a pretty weird "Oh Captain, My Captain" phase. So if you remember Robin Williams in Dead Poet Society, where he's standing on the desk yelling poetry, I may have done something silly like that
With your
once.
first graders?
Yeah, with first graders. There's a great poem called the Jabberwocky,
Oh,
and it
yes.
it lends itself the vocal score and the snicker snack. It's great, but the little bird walk, the little digression. The reality really is that you need to find that comfort zone with the curriculum, right? So you can make it relevant. But that means you have to be able to look at what's written, what's assessed, and really be thinking about how you're going to be teaching. You got to be thinking about that delivery method because that's where you're going to make it relevant, right? Um, Keep in mind that boredom has a negative 0.47 effect size, so that's pretty significant. Like boredom will disengage kids, and in a remote world, that's important.
It's super important because we really can't afford to have our scholars disengaged more so than what will inevitably happen but as we work out the kinks of having remote learning, right? We don't have them right there in our classroom. We don't have, like we talked in the last podcast, that opportunity to have proximity and be close with them. So really understanding how we can take the content that we're teaching and make it relevant, help kids see themselves in the work, in the content you're using, in the literature you're using, and just engage them that way, the better.
Yeah. So through those personal associations, making that content useful to them in some way, and helping them identify themselves within the text or within the content that you're teaching somehow. So, Brooke, I think I'm pretty close to finished with my coffee. How's yours?
I still have more coffee left, but this was a very big coffee.
Well,
So
that just means you get to do the editing and uploading it to YouTube.
I
If you have
can
more coffee, that maybe that's a good. Maybe that'll be our new rule. Like who has the most coffee and gets to do the post production work.
do it.
All right. I think we've come to the end. Thank you so very much for joining us. Have a great weekend, guys.